As you can probably imagine, like most of you, I'm a huge fan of starting meetings precisely on time. So, thank you for being here with me. You could be anywhere. If your boss isn't here with you, you could be out having a beer someplace, but you're here. I'm going to do my best not to waste your time in the next 30 minutes. I can barely see with these lights, but I'm going to try anyway. Let me ask a question. How many of you work in a large corporation? If you have an HR department, you're a large corporation. If you have departments, you're a large corporation. If you don't know everybody you work with by name, you're a large corporation. So quite a few. I sympathize. But I couldn't say that before. I've been on this stage a few times. Some of you might know me. And I have been here as an agile and lean principles evangelist. But a few years ago, I had a major life change. I ran out of ideas for how to evolve my company, so I gave control of it over to the guy who is speaking on the other track, and he's doing a brilliant job of it. And I had to figure out what to do with my life next. So I became a Kanban trainer because I thought I would really enjoy sharing this stuff with a larger audience. And I became accredited, and something magic happens when you become accredited. You can give out little pieces of paper that people will pay a lot more money for, even though it's basically the same class. And so I started training in large organizations, and I kept running into the same thing over and over and over again, like a mantra. Those are great ideas, and I love those stories about how they worked in your cute little startups. But you have no idea the kind of complexity that we're dealing with here, the kind of audits and security issues and multiple teams on multiple continents. So that just wouldn't work here. And I started actually doubting myself. I don't think terribly highly of consultants who have never done what they're telling other people to do, and trainers who have never done what they're teaching other people to do. So I started wondering, I still believed in my principles, but I started wondering if the application was really so different in a large organization. And so one day, I was walking home, and I was walking past this big gleaming white building that had just been built a few years before, 700 meters from my home, when my cell phone buzzed, and I pulled it out, and it was an email from a recruiter. So I'm standing in front of this building, I get an email from a recruiter saying, "Your profile looks like you might be a good fit," or something like that, "for a Scrum coach position in HSBC in Krakow." And I was like, 10-minute commute? Yeah, why not? And iPhone is great because all the phone numbers automatically dial. So I just hit the dial button. And this is probably the first time in the recruiter's life she's gotten a call 10 seconds after sending an email. I said, "Yeah, sure. How do I interview?" She didn't know what to do with that. She was rather surprised. But long story short, I got the interview, I got the job, and now all of a sudden, I am a Scrum coach in one of the world's largest and oldest banks. Talk about regulated, talk about complex. Any system goes down and it's national headlines. So I went out. I was used to having jobs where I didn't have to wear shoes. So I went out, I had myself a suit made with 3 identical pairs of pants. I went to London to my favorite shirt maker, got 4 identical shirts. And just to make it fun, I went to Happy Socks and got some fun, colorful socks. And that was going to be my work uniform. And I showed up, and they threw me right into it. A quick health and safety session, and then I was in a conference room with a brand new team of new hires and this really energetic product owner who spent the whole day telling us everything about the intricacies of the Hong Kong personal loan market. The biggest takeaway that I had from that day is towards the end of the day, when I went up to see the floor where I'd be working on my cubicle, I was standing and looking at a chart of the team I'd be working with, a positions chart, and we had hired maybe 80% of the team at this point. There are a few people still left to fill. And one of the senior managers from London was looking at it and pointed out, so far you only have one experienced back-end developer. And the look on her face when I just naturally said, "Well, then we're going to have to be sure she's never busy," told me that maybe I did have something to contribute in this environment. So we got started, and for the first few weeks, there wasn't much to do because we hadn't gotten our product backlog, we hadn't met the market stakeholders yet. And so I got to have a lot of fun. And one of the things that I did early on was start holding lean coffee meetings with everybody in the department, because there are multiple teams working on multiple products for multiple markets, but in the same general way. So I brought them all together for regular lean coffee meetings. And if you're not familiar with this, it's a meeting format created by Jim Benson. It's incredibly useful whenever you want to add a bit of structure to a conversation with a bunch of people with a similar interest. You just get everybody in a room together, and as they come in, they can write any topic they want to talk about on the whiteboard, no matter what it is, like no estimates, when are we going to get our max, what have you. And then you do a quick vote. We just raise hands and I write down numbers on how many people want to talk about each topic. I set a timer for 5 minutes. And then we start talking about the most popular topic. And about 5 minutes in, we do a silent vote to either continue talking for another 5 minutes on the same topic, to stop talking and move on to the next most popular topic, or if you're indifferent, to do this. And that way you just work through the whole agenda, or until your time box is over. And one of the interesting things that came out of this was one of the things that all of these new employees noticed very quickly is that HSBC loves meetings. There's no problem that can't be solved, or at least made better, or at least forgotten for an hour with a meeting. And they were worried about that because they were knowledge workers and they didn't like their day being broken up. And so they came up with a few rules during Lean Coffee about meetings. No meetings between 11 and 3. They understand that there's meetings that have to happen, but they wanted to have a solid block of time when they could work uninterrupted. No meetings can last more than an hour. People's brains start turning off after an hour, they decided. If it was that big, they would have 2 meetings about it. All meetings should be optional. If I don't think I can contribute or learn anything, I don't have to go. And anybody can walk out of a meeting at any time if they're not getting value from it. Now, needless to say, when we posted these decisions on the wall as team policies, management was a little bit confused and concerned. When they call a meeting, they like people to show up. But 9 months into it now, we haven't had a single incident in which no one showed up to a meeting or the right people weren't there, because surprise, surprise, software development teams are composed entirely of intelligent adults who are generally good-willed. It hasn't been a problem. And that brings me to the thesis of my argument here, which is that one of the surprising things that I found is, in my opinion, after years of working with small startups and then 9 months in one of the world's largest banks, is that it's easier to practice agile and lean principles in a large corporation than in a small organization, and especially a startup. Because in a startup, you tend to have one big ego, who is the person who's putting their whole life at risk. Maybe you have some money people who have really strong opinions, and they're really intractable. Whereas a corporation is a conglomeration of committees with one big goal, with lots of small little goals. And a committee, Robert Heinlein once said that a committee is an animal with 10 arms and 10 legs and no brain. I wouldn't say that's true, but it is an animal with 10 arms, 10 legs, and no ego. A committee is formed in order to accomplish certain goals, and if you have some practical ideas on how to achieve those goals, you're not going to run into the same kind of ego pressure that you get from a startup founded with a vision. So let's talk about principles, because it's much easier to sell things on the basis of principles. This is another thing I like about corporations. They have a set of values, and even if every single individual in the corporation doesn't personally espouse all of those values, they have at least agreed to pretend to while they're at work. So you can start with a principle, like meetings, for example. You can say, well, all the big Silicon Valley startups are saying no meetings, so we should do no meetings, and nobody's going to buy that. But if you start with something like, hey, we all respect people, right? That's a fundamental principle of our organization, respect for people. It's probably in the values statement someplace. And so this is the kind of question I ask a lot at work. What would meetings here look like if they were organized around respect for people? Would we be notifying them further in advance? Would we be including an agenda so they can prepare and think in advance about whether or not they ought to be there? Would we be checking their calendars? to make sure that they're free so they don't have to juggle too many things around. And when you ask questions like that, how do we make meetings here more respectful for people and more in line with our values, you're able to start seeing changes and getting buy-in for changes. Another thing that I did, you might take this away as a useful thing. I figure if I'm pulling people into a meeting or inviting people to a meeting and taking up their time, I need to make sure, it's my responsibility to make sure that their time is well spent. And so I came up finally after a few different trials with a very simple feedback mechanism. I put 3 envelopes on the door outside the door to the meeting room, so it's anonymous. And when people come into the meeting, I hand them a poker chip. And I chose poker chips because I can buy a bunch of them pretty cheap, but they're still kind of cool. When somebody hands you a poker chip and it's kind of shiny, has a little hologram, you grab it. You want to feel what it's like. If you haven't been to a casino, you may have never handled a poker chip. And so they have this. And now, unlike a scrap of paper, they can't just wad it up and throw it away. It's my poker chip, and they have to give it back to me, and this is how they give it back. And this is really useful for two kinds of meetings. One, for anything that's completely new, a type of meeting or a meeting format that we've never had, I can get a quick feedback on whether or not the team finds that valuable. And it's also really good for recurring meetings, and it's simple enough to use for stand-ups. So as I'm making small changes to how I organize recurring meetings, I can see whether those changes are being well received. So, next principle, transparency. This is a principle of Kanban. Needless to say, after the first day of lectures, the second thing that we did was we built our Kanban board. And because other teams had gone before us, and there were some products that are already in development, somebody asked the question, why don't we just copy the Kanban boards of another team as a starting point? And I'm glad we didn't for a few reasons. Number one, it took us about 4 hours to build our first Kanban board. But we had to ask a lot of really useful questions, like what kind of work are we going to be doing? What form is it going to come in? Where is it going to come from? How often is it going to come? Who's going to handle it? How does things get from one state to another? What kind of approvals and permissions do we need to do things like design changes and copy changes? And the other really valuable thing that came out of this is because the team built the entire system themselves, they felt a sense of ownership over it. And so as a result, over the course of the last 9 months, our board has gone through 3 rather dramatic changes. There's been a number of changes to the WIP limits, 1 entire column was removed, and most of the exit criteria for the working states have been rewritten. And at the same time, I've seen other teams where nothing changes on their board. If your Kanban board isn't changing during the year, it means that you're either not learning anything anymore, or that your team is hiding change from you because they think that somebody else owns the process, a manager or a scrum master or what have you. Another thing that we did with boards, which is kind of fun, is we started using icons to call attention to things that were useful for us. Like, for example, we have to use Jira. We have to use Jira because we have to collaborate with other teams that don't sit with us. And so we have a physical board and a Jira board, and we have to keep them synchronized. So we have a rule that when you move something in one place, you move it in the other too. It's a little tedious, but just a little. It's just a habit. But when I notice that something's out of sync, I put this icon on it, and that's just a signal that whoever knows what's going on with this task needs to make sure that one or the other of the 2 boards is correct. I used to use it a lot. Now I never use it anymore because it's become a habit. This one, luckily I don't use much anymore either. This is for the 1-month anniversary of a story's time on the board, because our lead times used to be pretty long. And it just calls attention to what we've invested a lot of time in and really need to get finished. This one is fun too. We use a Sisyphus to indicate a task that turns out to be a lot harder than the person who pulled it thought it was going to be. Now, usually this would happen in a stand-up. They would say, well, yeah, you know that thing that I said I was working on yesterday? It's bigger than I thought. But with this, when somebody comes up and puts the Sisyphus icon on a card, people notice and they go and talk to them about it. And so things tend to get resolved more quickly. This one is for code reviews, and we've got a special one for code reviews that require input from outside of the team. So that's a signal to me that I might be able to help facilitate those conversations. You can probably guess this one. It's what we're going to ship next. And this is one of my favorites. This is Suspicious Guy. I stick this on anything that catches my eye, like, that blocker's been there for a while. Or, how can that task be in development without anyone actually working on it? It has no avatar. That's odd. So these things just spark conversations during the day rather than waiting for the stand-up. This is another fun thing I've been doing. Every single day after the stand-up, I put a dot on every single card. A green dot for every card that's in a working state, and a blue dot for every card that's in a queuing state. And it's really valuable for a lot of reasons. It lets people see very quickly what cards have been on the board for the longest, so it helps people make decisions about what tasks to pull if they have multiple things that they could be working on. The number of blue dots that we had early on indicated that we had a lot of cards waiting in a waiting state for too long. So when a senior manager, I don't know who it was, some new CTO or something, was doing a whirlwind tour of our floor and asked me, so why is it that you've got these lead times of over a month? I was able to pull just a few story cards off the done column and say, well, look at this. They're sitting in waiting states for weeks. And I was able to point to the cards that were in the discovery phase and say, look at this. These cards have 7, 10 dots on them. So if it takes us 2 weeks just to get the information we need to start work on something, how fast do you actually expect it to get done? And this is one of the reasons why we reduced our WIP limits in order to reduce our cycle time. I mean, our lead time. Something we just started 2 weeks ago, which is really useful, is that anytime somebody touches something on a board, they add a little green arrow to it. And so during the stand-up, we can see exactly what's changed since the last stand-up. We can also see if the team if there's generally more things happening or less things happening. So we usually have like 8 to 12 arrows on the board, but after karaoke night, there are only 4. So we can definitely see what has an impact on our productivity. And it also calls attention to the things that don't change. Like when you've got the task that's been on the board in development for twice as long as anything else, and nothing happened to it in the last 24 hours, or a blocker that's collected yet another dot. So it helps during the stand-ups to guide the conversations to the issues that might be most urgent and most useful. I also extend that transparency outward. I started publishing cumulative flow diagrams in all of my reports. Now, nobody knows how to read a cumulative flow diagram, especially those hideous ones that are automatically generated by Jira. So I used a template that Troy McGinnis shares for free from his GitHub page, which is brilliant. You can lose yourself in that site. But I started annotating it. So I would send it out with things like here, you can see, our lead time used to be over 2 months when we had this much work in progress, and now that we've got less work in progress, our lead time is cut in half. So I send things out like that, and I share them in Slack channels and such, and get people talking about them. Or it might be annotated to show, this is where our tester got sick, and look how we had this little balloon in development that we've just recovered from now. See what the impact that was. And now other teams are starting to produce cumulative flow diagrams. This is a favorite chart. This is the average throughput projected into the future. Like a horrible way of forecasting. But it's a standard chart, and I built it just to see what it would look like. And people looked at it, and they kind of got freaked out about where it went. And so I'm not proud to say that when I was asked to add what they were calling an enabled line, this is what our throughput would look like if everything went smoothly. And it wasn't based on nothing. It was based on the average throughput of more experienced teams working in similar environments. But I did it. I'm not proud of it. However, I insisted on calling it the magic line and making it pink. And I found out people were watching only the magic line when somebody asked me, so are we going to be ready for that pilot in 2 weeks? And I said, are you kidding? We've got an average lead time of a month, which means it takes about a month for everything on our Kanban board to get off the board. And we've got stuff for that pilot that just hit the board today. So no way. And that led to an afternoon of furious, frantic phone calls from people way too high up in the organization to talk to me, at the end of which, lo and behold, everyone accepted reality as what it was and the pink line disappeared. And so I then started calling this average throughput line what it really is, which is the 50% confidence interval. And that sparked some interesting conversations. Like, what do you mean 50% confidence interval? I mean, well, it's the average. So, flip a coin. Half the time in the future will be better and half the time it will be worse. and how much better and worse. I can talk about things like the fact that our lead time distribution is not a normal distribution. So this doesn't mean that we might be early by a week and we might be late by a week. It means we might be early by a week and we might be late by a month. So we can talk about those distributions, and we can talk about what kind of confidence interval people actually want to be making their decisions based on, maybe 85, maybe 90. And so I've started doing the same thing that I did with the cumulative flow diagram. I started incorporating Monte Carlo simulations into my reports just to get people thinking and asking questions about what these things are. So hopefully this is going to be the first step towards actually doing probabilistic forecasting inside HSBC. So the next principle I want to talk about, and this is a Kanban principle, is encourage acts of leadership at all levels. And I love the way that David Anderson answered the question, what does leadership look like in a software team? Right on the cover of the Kanban book, there's this cartoon. Leadership doesn't look like standing up on a mountain and screaming out orders. It doesn't look like pulling out a sword and saying, once more into the breach. Leadership looks like when your team members are having troubles, not saying, oh man, that sucks, or that must really be frustrating. That's sympathy and empathy. Leadership looks like, hey, let's do something about that. And it happens all the time at all levels. You often don't see it, but I try to encourage it. One of the ways that I do it is during the stand-ups. If someone has a problem and I know the answer, I never share it unless I absolutely have to and last. My role in the stand-ups is usually to ask questions like, is that something we can do something about? Can anyone help? Do we want to have a conversation about this? And only when everything else has been exhausted and my idea still hasn't been out there, I might share the idea. But another place where leadership happens at all levels inside the team is we started using Claudio Peroni's popcorn flow approach to having meetings in which the team would identify problems over here and then come up with a handful of potential solutions at a high level and then identify experiments that they could do quickly, like in a matter of hours or days, just to find out whether one of those solutions might be useful. And that meeting is a great place for people to come up with ideas and solve problems at all levels. But that doesn't just happen in meetings. It also happens a lot where you don't see it. And so I've implemented the same program that I created for Lunar Logic, which is kudos, which is a way that people can publicly give thanks to somebody else in the organization for doing something that they appreciated. They just give them a kudos card and mention it on our team Slack channel so that everyone can see that leadership is actually happening all over the place. It's a way of normalizing helping out and solving problems. So another principle. Now, obviously, I'm a Kanban coach, so flow is very important to me. I measure my performance as a coach in how often I see people making decisions about how to spend their time based on flow thinking and flow principles. So, for example, it's a terrible thing to see a whole team being busy. During a stand-up, I'm always very nervous. My team knows that I'm nervous when each person says, I'm doing this task, I'm doing this one, I'm doing this one, she's doing that one, he's doing that one. Because that means if anyone needs help or if anything comes up that we don't anticipate today, everybody's too busy to do anything about it. So they know that I like it a lot more when somebody says, I'm doing this, I'm researching this idea, I'm doing this task, I'm helping her. Because when you have something like that going on and an emergency comes up or something more important comes up or something becomes more difficult than you thought or somebody else needs help, that person who's just helping can say, okay, you take this to the end and I'm going to go help over here. It gives you that flexibility. I also love it when somebody does something like finishes a task and says, okay, I need a code review on this. And instead of starting something else, they think, you know, it takes about an hour to get a code review. And if I start this thing, it's going to take me a day or two to finish it. So my team is starting to understand that it's better to wait, have a cup of coffee, do a little bit of research, play some foosball, because they're beginning to understand that it's better to have people waiting for work than work waiting for a person to do it. If the goal is to move the work through the system, then work that's waiting for a person isn't flowing. We also base everything that we do on agreements. Agreements are very important to me. I want to make sure that everyone's got buy-in. So one of the things that we do is it's a Kanban practice, which is probably the least popular Kanban practice. I don't know that I've ever actually seen this anyplace, and that is to make policies explicit. When we do find ourselves in a situation where the team feels like they need a rule in order to make sure that something happens the right way every time, or that something bad never happens again, we get together as a team and we make a policy and we write it down, what the policy is, the problem it's intended to solve, and we put it up on the wall. And we don't have so many of these. And the great thing about making them explicit, putting them up on the wall, is it invites conversations about it. So now management understands how we're thinking and why we're doing things the way we do. It also helps us to remember why we do things the way we do. So for example, just last week, we had a small parcel of work that was almost ready. It just needed to be tested on devices. And one of the managers came over and said, "Can you deploy this on Friday?" He said this on Wednesday. And I said, no, the team has policy against planning to deploy something until it's completely finished, because things go wrong and then it becomes chaos. And she was not really happy with that, but I felt a little vindicated when the next afternoon, at the time when we would have been doing device testing, our UAT environment went down. And if we had done all the paperwork and all of the organization to deploy that functionality, that would have been a crisis. We would have had to find some way to do that device testing or have a failed deployment. But instead, since we hadn't actually planned to deploy that batch of work, we just notified the team that the environment was down, the team that was responsible for maintaining it, and we went about our business, and we ended up deploying that batch of work on Monday, yesterday. Which, by the way, I told you we had a really difficult time deploying before. We're now deploying every single day, and I want to get that up to twice a day and eventually continuously. Because that brings me to my last point, which is that I told you I wore colorful socks because I wanted to jazz up the corporate uniform a little bit. But I got a story about the socks. I did something that I was really ashamed of in retrospect. About 6 weeks into this new job, some senior person publicly challenged me to get a parcel of work that we had ready onto a production server. And he said, no team in our department has ever done that in less than a month, because it's even if a product isn't live in the banking industry, every single deployment to a production server is handled the same way as actual live applications. And this is an environment where if you have three outages in a year, you can lose your banking license, in which every single hiccup makes front page news. So it's challenging to understand and implement the entire pipeline. But he said, it's been done before by all these other teams. There's like 6 other teams who have been through the pain. Learn from them, and you be the first person to do in a week, or the first team to do in a week. And I said, hoorah, okay. Come on, team, let's do this. We can do this. We can do what's never been done before. And they said, okay. And so we talked to all the other teams. We found out how they did it. We mimicked what worked for them. We set everything up. It ended up taking 2 weeks, but that would still be a huge improvement over the past. And then when we hit deploy, 2 weeks into it, it failed because of some little component of the pipeline that nobody even knew the name of. It took us a couple of days to figure out what it was that went wrong. A couple more days to find this Indian team of 5 people who maintained that thing. And ultimately, it took several tries before we finally managed to deploy something to production, which, as I said, we're now doing every single day and will soon be doing even more often. But back then, it was really painful. And when we did that, I felt no sense of accomplishment. I felt only shame at letting my team down, getting them so excited, so worked up, and then so stressed for so long by committing to doing something without really understanding what it was and what it entailed. And I had a bit of crisis, and I wondered whether I was really up to this kind of corporate thing. And as I was getting dressed the next morning, I had this kind of epiphany. I mismatched my socks. And I decided I'm going to do this. Every morning, from now on, my corporate uniform includes mismatched happy socks. So every single morning, as I'm getting dressed, I'm reminding myself, I did not take this job to be a happy little cog in a machine. I took this job to question assumptions, to make change, to do things differently. And today and every day, I'm going to do things differently. And my team knows this story. And so now sometimes when I'm being pressured to follow the corporate line, somebody might say, so what, Paul? Are your socks matching today? No, they're not. And this is what I've learned from driving change in a large organization is that principle-driven change works. It works very well, even in a large corporation, probably better in a large corporation. It just takes that one additional crucial element which is necessary for Agile, that core Agile principle of courage. Anyone can do it. It just takes a bit of bravery.